Welcome to Sophie and Jumong Part 39. Remember to subscribe and drop the country in which you're watching from. Thank you. It was a quiet Saturday morning. The scent of tea drifted through the luxurious living room as soft jazz played in the background. Sophie, 4 months into her pregnancy, sat curled up on the couch beside Jumong, her head resting gently against his shoulder. They had intentionally chosen to stay home that weekend. Earlier that morning, Sophie had video-called her mother in Namibia. Mama was packing, excitedly preparing to come to Korea. Sophie had smiled as she watched her mother organize boxes of herbs, books, and colorful wraps she insisted Sophie would need. There was a sacred comfort in her voice, the kind that made Sophie forget the heaviness of duty, even if just for a moment. Sophie had shared with her mother a strange dream she'd had the night before. She was standing in a white corridor, holding a child close to her chest while a woman sobbed at her feet. Sophie had bent down, wiped the woman's tears with the back of her hand, and whispered something she couldn't remember. Her mother, upon hearing it, closed her eyes and said, "Sometimes dreams are doors, baby. Walk through." It was just after that call that Sophie joined Jumong in front of the television. A local morning show was airing stories of citizens with incredible needs. It was meant to inspire charity and awareness, but this time something pierced deeper. The screen showed a young Korean mother seated on a clinic bench, her face tired and pale. In her lap, a child, no older than 4, clung to her hand, thin and quiet. The woman spoke through tears. "They say it's too complicated. They say they can't do it. But he's all I have. I've gone to every hospital I could reach. But they say his condition is beyond help." Sophie straightened in her seat. Jumong noticed. "Are you okay?" Sophie's eyes stayed on the screen. "I dreamed about her," she said softly. "Or someone like her. This morning." "Do you want me to call the studio?" She didn't answer immediately. Then, as though something solid had formed in her chest, she nodded. "Yes, find her. I want to help." Within a few hours, the producer had connected them. Jumong used his networks to bring the woman to their hospital under a special fund, quietly managed by the board Jumong chaired. Sophie informed the medical staff of the incoming patient. When the woman arrived, Sophie met her personally at the hospital entrance. She was shorter than she appeared on screen, her face aged by exhaustion and fear. Her son, little Ho-jun, was even thinner than Sophie had imagined. Tests were run. Imaging was done. Later that afternoon, the board members and senior surgeons met. "This is severe cardiac malformation. His organs are misaligned. There's high risk of fatality during operation. Suggest palliative care and counseling for the mother." Sophie remained silent, listening. Then she stood. "I will operate on him," she said. The room fell silent. "Sophie C., with all due respect, you're pregnant. 4 months in. We don't expect you to even take up regular shifts." "I understand," she replied, "but I've reviewed the scans. I know the risks. I also know the possibility, and I know this boy still has a chance. I became a surgeon for moments like this. I will not step aside because it's hard." No one argued further. Within hours, the media picked it up, and a wave of national attention surged behind the story. Dr. Sophie Lee, the Namibian woman married to Lee Jumong, was not just a headline. She was a symbol of defiance against impossible odds. In the hospital corridors. At the main Seoul Medical Center, the mood among staff was sharply divided. Some younger doctors whispered with admiration, "Did you hear Dr. Sophie Lee took the case? I thought no one would take it. She's insane, or brave, or both." But not everyone was thrilled. Among them, Dr. Choi Hwang, a senior cardiothoracic surgeon with more than 20 years of experience, stood stiffly in front of a cluster of administrators. "She's going to destroy this hospital's name," he muttered bitterly. "This is not some fairy tale. This is a child with a critical congenital heart defect. 2 of our top surgeons already declined. What makes her think she can save him?" The director of surgery, a composed woman in her 50s, gave him a sharp glance. "She volunteered, and the board approved it. She knows the risks." Dr. Choi scoffed. She's making this about drama. Her husband builds her a wing and suddenly she wants to play Messiah? This isn't some African village, this is Seoul. We do real medicine here. One of the younger doctors frowned. With respect, sir, she trained here. She was top of her class. Dr. Choi's lips curled. We'll see how top she is when she opens that child's chest tomorrow. By evening, major news networks were covering the event. Hashtags began trending on Korean social media. Sophie Lee miracle. Hope for the child. Namibian doctor in Korea. For Lee Jumong wife surgeon. A well-known news anchor opened the 9 p.m. news with the words, tomorrow morning, a surgery will take place that most doctors have declared impossible. But one woman, a surgeon, a wife, a foreigner, has stepped forward when others turned away. Who is Dr. Sophie Lee? And why does she believe she can succeed where others have surrendered? Clips of Sophie from previous charity events played on screen. News crews lined up outside Seoul Medical Center. And in one special segment, a retired professor of surgery at Seoul National University was interviewed from his home. The gray-haired man nodded slowly, staring at a file he'd dug from his archives. This, he said, holding up a paper, was her final surgery assessment score. She had the steadiest hand I've ever seen in a student. But what set her apart was her mindset, prayerful, calm, fierce when protecting a life. The anchor asked, do you think she can save the child? He hesitated. If you asked me clinically, I'd say it's unlikely. But with Sophie Lee, he smiled faintly, you don't rule out a miracle. That quote spread like wildfire. Back at home, Sophie sat on the edge of the couch, the glow of the television flickering over her tired face. Jumong stood behind her, gently massaging her shoulders. You've barely moved all day, he said softly. She didn't respond for a moment. Then quietly, they don't believe I can do it. Then show them, he replied. Sophie looked down at her hands. They're small, she whispered. Do you know one of the doctors today said to me, this case needs bigger hands, more experience? I smiled, but it burned. You have something more powerful than big hands, Jumong said, kneeling beside her. You have conviction, you have God, and you've always had me. She smiled faintly, her fingers touched her stomach. I'm afraid, she confessed. So am I, he admitted. Then Sophie did what she always did the night before any surgery. She knelt beside the bed and whispered a prayer. God, you made this child, so you know the way. Guide my hands. Give me courage. Let this mother hold her baby again. Back at the hospital, Dr. Choi wasn't done. He met quietly with a resident. She can't just fly in and take credit. She needs to be reminded where she is. The resident hesitated. Sir, what are you saying? Nothing dangerous, he said, eyes cold. But if one of the scans were misread, if she doubted herself tomorrow, perhaps she'd cancel. You understand? The resident left pale-faced. At 11 p.m., Sophie received a knock at her door. It was a nurse, bringing her the latest scan of the child's heart. As Sophie read through it, her brow furrowed. Something was off. She called the radiology department. And within the hour, they confirmed. Someone had altered the scan. It was a near miss. Jumong, watching her calmly but firmly restore the truth, felt his heart thunder with pride. You're already changing lives, he said. Sophie whispered, then I must protect every life, no matter who tries to stop me. The hallway leading to the operating theater was almost silent, except for the low hum of machines and muffled footsteps. It was just after 6 a.m. The hospital was slowly waking up, but Sophie had already been up for hours. Her hands were clean, her mind was sharp, her spirit, though surrounded by whispers of doubt, was anchored. Sophie walked steadily toward the OR, dressed in her surgical scrubs, a light blue gown draped over her growing belly. She was 4 months pregnant, and it showed just enough to make people notice. But she walked like a woman who had something to prove and something to protect. Sophie took a deep breath, then pushed the doors open. Inside the operating theater, the medical team turned to look. The anesthesiologist was adjusting the oxygen supply. Two junior doctors stood behind the surgical tray. Nurses were checking monitors. Dr. Min, one of the board surgeons, was present only as a supervisor. His arms were folded, his eyes doubtful. As Sophie stepped in, there was a noticeable pause in the room. She's going to operate? In her condition? Why didn't they assign someone else? The whispers were not subtle. Sophie moved to the central basin and washed her hands again, then slipped on her gloves. She turned to the surgical nurse. Scalpel. The nurse hesitated. Dr. Min raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Scalpel, Sophie repeated, her voice calm but firm. This time, the nurse handed it to her. The child, little Hojun, lay on the table, unconscious, his chest rising and falling under anesthesia. His vitals were stable. The screen beside him showed his heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen levels. Let's begin. Time of incision 6:32 a.m., Sophie said. The room adjusted. She made the first cut gently, right above the sternum, her hands steady. Her movements were precise. She asked for the retractor. It was given. Opening the chest cavity now, she announced. As the chest opened, the child's malformed heart was exposed. The room fell even quieter. One doctor whispered, "How is she this calm?" "Retract further," Sophie instructed. "I need full visual of the lower ventricle." They adjusted. She leaned in. "Anomaly confirmed. Left atrium is rotated. Aorta compressed. We're correcting the malformation first." At 7:05 a.m., Sophie began reconstructing the internal structures using fine microsutures. It was a complicated task, something even veteran surgeons hesitated to do. "Suction here, please. I need a clean view," she said. But the nurse was slow, too slow. "Suction," Sophie repeated. Still no action. Dr. Min stepped forward, but Sophie cut him off. "Nurse, I need you to focus. Hand me the suction or step aside." Shaken, the nurse finally responded. Sophie continued, carefully removing obstructions and making repairs. At 7:40 a.m., something went wrong. The heart rate monitor dipped suddenly. Beep, beep, beep. A sharp drop, a gasp in the room. "His pressure's crashing," someone whispered. Sophie's eyes narrowed. "Clamp now!" Another hesitation. "Clamp!" she said again, louder. The junior doctor handed her the clamp. She applied it within seconds, stopping the bleeding. "Blood loss minimal. I need a fresh suture. Stat." Hands moved faster now. People responded. Sophie had taken control. "I need the cardiac stabilizer set up. He's fibrillating slightly. Get it ready." They brought the machine. At 8:15 a.m., the child's vitals were weak but stable. The reconstruction continued. She repaired the misalignment in the pulmonary artery, corrected the valve distortion. "Sponge, irrigation. I need full view of the left wall." A nurse handed her a sponge. Sophie dabbed and checked. Her eyes scanned every inch. At 8:55 a.m., the heart rhythm began to stabilize. BP rising, heart rate leveling. Sophie gave a slight nod. "Good. We proceed to close." She began suturing the chest cavity with precision, each stitch clean, firm. "Vitals are holding," said the anesthesiologist. Dr. Min was still watching, now quietly. The team began to believe. By 9:20 a.m., the final layer of sutures was done. Sophie stepped back, sweat dripping from her forehead. She looked over the monitors. Steady. The child was breathing. "He's safe," she said softly. One nurse let out a quiet sob of relief. Sophie peeled off her gloves. Her hands were sore, but her eyes were peaceful. Upstairs, in a quiet viewing room, a group of medical students from the university were watching the surgery broadcast live on a private feed. They weren't allowed to see the full operation, but they saw the stats and the silhouettes. When the light turned green, they stood, hands over their mouths, stunned. One of them said, "I want to be like her." Even the skeptical surgeon who had dismissed Sophie earlier, Dr. Kwan, had gone silent. He stood in the back of the viewing corridor, arms crossed. The moment the red light turned, he blinked, lowered his head, and said softly, "I was wrong." Meanwhile, on Twitter and Korean apps like Naver and Kakao Story, the hashtags were trending #1 globally. In under 10 minutes, nearly 4.6 million views were recorded on the news live stream from outside the hospital. Someone zoomed in on the light, capturing it turning green in real time. From Tokyo to Johannesburg, medical centers began ringing Jumong Hospital, requesting official updates. A university in Boston had already issued a statement praising the courage and skill of Dr. Lee, who exemplifies the future of global medicine. And yet, Sophie hadn't even stepped out of the theater yet. Back inside, behind the surgical doors, Sophie removed her gloves quietly. Sweat clung to her forehead, but her hands were steady. The team was still stunned. Nurses were catching their breath. One of the junior surgeons sat down for a second, whispering, "Is he really alive?" "Yes," Sophie said softly. "He made it." She glanced toward the double doors. She didn't know what was happening beyond them. She didn't even know the light had changed. She only felt the quiet peace that follows battle. The child's heart monitor beeped steadily. His chest was bandaged, his oxygen level stable. Sophie stood at the foot of the bed for one more moment. Then she whispered a prayer. Not loud, just in her heart. Outside, someone screamed, "There she is!" But not yet. She hadn't stepped out. The nurses near the surgical ward bowed. Even the stern-faced administrative nurse, who rarely showed emotion, dabbed her eyes and said, "She's one of us. She really is." Doctors in white coats lined the hallway. One of the senior cardiologists, who had refused to participate in the surgery, stood quietly now, hands behind his back. When Sophie would step out, he would be the first to bow. In the glass-walled observation corridor, the head of the Board of Trustees watched everything with arms folded. He whispered to the man beside him, "We must name that new wing after her. Dr. Sophie Lee, the Pediatric Heart Center." But Sophie hadn't stepped out yet. She stood in the operating room, staring down at the boy, her own breath finally calming. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of discipline and professionalism, she smiled. Because she knew the green light was not just a signal that surgery had ended. It was a signal to the world that hope had walked in.